In 2005, 5 teenagers left for a weekend camping trip and vanished without a trace. For 20 years, their disappearance tore through a small coastal town like an open wound that refused to heal. Then, a retired park ranger stumbled upon a rusted SUV buried in a ravine, and what she found inside would crack open 2 decades of silence, expose a twisted family secret, and lead a devastated mother to the hidden letter her son left behind, a confession that proved he fought until his very last breath. The community center parking lot buzzed with that particular kind of chaos that only happens when teenagers are set loose after hours of forced sitting. It was a Friday afternoon in early October 2005, and the weekend stretched ahead like an open road. 15-year-old Jamal Hassan stood near the curb, a worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, sketchbook tucked under his arm. He'd spent the last hour of the school's art showcase watching parents drift between tables, nodding politely at charcoal drawings and watercolor landscapes. His own piece, a moody portrait of the harbor at dusk, had earned him second place and a certificate his mother would frame before the night was over. Aliza Hassan waited by her sedan, keys dangling from her fingers, watching her son talk with his friends near the entrance. She was 35 then, still young enough to remember her own teenage years, old enough to worry about every small thing. Jamal had that restless energy tonight, the kind that made him bounce on his heels while he talked. He'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a weekend camping excursion organized by Arthur Vance, the father of his best friend, Connor. Arthur Vance pulled up in a dark green SUV just after 5 o'clock. He wasn't the warm, back-slapping kind of parent who showed up to every school event. He was quiet, methodical, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with careful precision. He worked for some local charity. Aliza could never remember the exact name and kept to himself mostly. But Connor spoke highly of his father, and the other parents seemed to trust him. "Mom, he's here." Jamal jogged over, his sneakers slapping against the asphalt. There was something in his jacket pocket, a white envelope she'd seen him seal that morning. When she'd asked about it, he'd shrugged and said it was just some assignment he needed to turn in later. But the way he kept touching it, making sure it was still there, told her it mattered more than he was letting on. "You have everything?" Aliza asked, pulling him into a quick hug. "Your medication? The allergy pills?" "Yes, Mom, everything." He grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness she couldn't name. She watched as he climbed into the SUV with the others, Connor Vance riding shotgun, Marcus Reed and Tyler Brooks piling into the back seats, their voices overlapping with laughter and half-shouted plans. Arthur Vance sat behind the wheel, his face unreadable as he adjusted the rearview mirror. Jamal turned back one last time as the vehicle began to roll forward. He lifted his hand in a small wave, fingers splayed. That same crooked smile he'd given her since he was 6 years old. She waved back, her hand lingering in the air, even after the SUV turned onto the main road and disappeared behind a line of coastal pines. It was supposed to be 3 days. A simple camping trip to a forest preserve 2 hours north. They'd be back Monday morning, sunburned and exhausted, and full of stories about who fell into the creek and who forgot to pack enough socks. But by Sunday evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the phone remained silent, Aliza felt the first cold finger of dread press against her chest. She called Arthur Vance's home number. No answer. She called Connor's cell phone, straight to voicemail. By midnight, she was calling every parent she could find in the school directory, her voice climbing higher with each unanswered ring. Monday morning arrived without them. The police were notified by noon. Search parties formed by Tuesday. And by the end of that first terrible week, the case of the Coastal Five had become the kind of story that stops a community cold. 5 bright teenagers and 1 responsible adult, swallowed whole by the forest, as if the earth itself had opened up and taken them. Aliza Hassan refused to believe her son was gone. She couldn't, because mothers know things that defy logic and evidence. They know the weight of their child's presence in the world, and she still felt Jamal out there, somewhere, fighting to come home. She just didn't know it would take 20 years to prove she was right. Before we continue, I need to pause here for just a moment. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this investigation. If you're comfortable, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're listening from and what drew you to Cold Trail today. Are you driving to work? Walking your dog? Lying awake at 2 a.m. because you can't stop thinking about these cases? Your engagement is what keeps these untold stories alive. It's what gives voices to people like Aliza Hassan, who fought for decades to be heard. So don't just scroll past, leave that comment. Subscribe if you haven't already. And turn on notifications, because this story is about to take a turn that will shake you to your core. Now, let me tell you what happened to Jamal Hassan. Lila Kemp had been retired from the Park Service for 3 years when she found the SUV. She was 62, lean and weathered from decades of trail maintenance and fire watches. And she still hiked the old preserve routes twice a week because sitting still had never agreed with her. On this particular October morning, the air was sharp with the smell of wet leaves and pine sap, the kind of cold that made your lungs ache in a good way. She'd left the main trail around mile marker 7, following what looked like an old game path that twisted down into a section of forest she didn't recognize. 20 years of growth could change a landscape completely. Trees that had been saplings were now thick-trunked giants, and underbrush had swallowed what might have once been a service road. She was about to turn back when she saw it, a glint of metal through the dense foliage, down in a ravine about 30 feet below the ridgeline. At first, she thought it was a fridge. People dumped the strangest things in these woods. But as she picked her way down the slope, grabbing onto exposed roots and low branches, the shape became clearer. It was a vehicle. A dark green SUV, nose first into the ravine, nearly consumed by 20 years of rust, moss, and creeping vines. The front end was crumpled against a massive oak, the windshield long since shattered into pebbled fragments scattered across the forest floor. Lila pulled her radio from her belt with shaking hands. "Base. I need immediate assistance at Sector 9, coordinates." She rattled off the numbers, her voice steady from years of training, even as her mind raced. "I've found a vehicle. Looks old, very old. There might be." She paused, swallowing hard as she moved closer to the driver's side window. "There might be remains inside." The response crackled back immediately, urgent and clipped. "Copy that. Units en route. Do not approach the vehicle. Repeat, do not approach." But Lila had already looked inside, through the empty window frame. She could see what was left of the driver's seat. The skeleton was still buckled in, slumped forward against the steering wheel, clothing rotted to barely recognizable tatters. Behind it, in the back seats, 2 more sets of remains, smaller, positioned as if they'd been sleeping when the vehicle went off the road. 3 people. But even through her shock, through the hammering of her pulse in her ears, Lila's trained eye caught something that didn't fit. The interior wasn't consistent with a crash. The back seats looked deliberately arranged, almost carefully positioned, and there were items scattered across the floor that shouldn't have survived 2 decades of exposure. A water bottle, the plastic still intact. A tarp, folded in the cargo area. This wasn't just a crash site. This was a tomb. Within hours, the ravine was swarming with investigators. The local sheriff's department called in the state police. Crime scene tape went up in a wide perimeter. News vans appeared on the forest access roads by sunset, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like metal flowers seeking light. The vehicle was identified within 2 days through the VIN stamped on the engine block. A 2004 Ford Explorer, registered to Arthur Vance, age 47 at the time of disappearance. Last seen leaving a community center in October 2005 with 4 teenage passengers. The remains told their own grim story. The driver was Arthur Vance himself, identified through dental records. The 2 bodies in the back seat belonged to Marcus Reed and Tyler Brooks, both 15 years old when they vanished. Cause of death for all 3 was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed collision, though the coroner noted evidence of prolonged exposure and possible survival for several hours post-impact. But only 3 bodies. The SUV had left with 6 people inside, Jamal Hassan and Connor Vance were not among the dead. Detective Marcus Silas stood on Eliza Hassan's doorstep on a gray Wednesday morning, his badge already in hand, his face set in that careful, neutral expression law enforcement officers wear when they're about to deliver news that will crack someone's world open. He was 49, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of permanent weariness that came from 20 years working homicide and cold cases. He'd inherited this case from 3 previous detectives, and he'd read the file so many times, he could recite whole sections from memory. Eliza opened the door before he could knock a second time. She was 55 now. Her dark hair streaked with gray she'd stopped bothering to cover years ago. She wore jeans and a faded blue sweater, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. The apartment behind her was small but meticulously kept, a 1-bedroom overlooking the harbor. The walls covered with photographs spanning 20 years. Most of them featured a teenage boy with sharp cheekbones and his mother's intense eyes. She looked at the detective's badge, and her expression didn't change. "You found something." It wasn't a question. "Miss Hassan, I'm Detective Silas with... I know who you are." She stepped back, holding the door open. "You might as well come in." The apartment smelled like coffee and old paper. The kitchen table was covered with file folders, printouts, maps marked with highlighter and pins. Eliza had never stopped looking, never stopped calling the tip lines, never stopped filing Freedom of Information requests, never stopped maintaining her own parallel investigation that the local police had long ago stopped taking seriously. Silas sat down without being invited, placing his folder on the only clear space available. "We found the vehicle yesterday morning. A hiker came across it in the Northern Preserve, about 8 miles from where the search teams focused in 2005. Eliza's hands were folded on the table, knuckles white. "How many?" "3 confirmed. Arthur Vance and 2 of the teenagers, Marcus Reed and Tyler Brooks. The medical examiner believes they died in the initial crash, or shortly after, approximately 20 years ago based on decomposition patterns. Jamal isn't there." Again, not a question. She said it with the same absolute certainty she'd carried for 2 decades. The thing that had made her a pariah in her own community. The crazy woman who couldn't accept reality. Silas met her eyes. "No, ma'am. Your son's remains were not recovered from the vehicle. Neither were Connor Vance's." Something shifted in Eliza's face. Some tectonic plate, deep beneath the surface. For 20 years, she'd been told to accept, to grieve, to move on. The community had held a memorial service after year 5. The school had dedicated a plaque. Her own sister had stopped calling after year 10, exhausted by Eliza's refusal to let go. But now, sitting across from this detective with his careful words and manila folder, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Vindication. "You're going to tell me they want to close the case," she said quietly. "You're going to say it was an accident, that the other 2 probably wandered off and died of exposure, that I should sign the death certificates and let my son rest in peace." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "But I'm going to tell you the same thing I've told every detective before you. My son survived that crash. And somebody needs to find out what happened to him after." Silas opened his folder slowly. Inside were crime scene photographs, preliminary reports, evidence logs, and clipped to the inside cover, flagged with a yellow sticky note, was a photocopy of a document that had been found tucked into the glove compartment of the SUV. It was an adoption petition, dated 3 months before the disappearance. The names had been partially obscured by water damage, but enough remained visible to raise questions that Silas couldn't ignore. He slid it across the table toward Eliza. "I need you to look at this and tell me if you recognize any of these names or signatures." Eliza pulled her reading glasses down and studied the document. Her hands began to shake. The signatures at the bottom were barely legible. The letterhead from some local nonprofit organization she vaguely remembered from school fundraisers. But the child's name listed on line 7 made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't Jamal Hassan. It was Jamal Vance. She looked up at Detective Silas, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "That's what I'm hoping you can help me figure out, Miss Hassan." Silas closed the folder. Because something about this case has never been right. And I think it's time we found out what really happened in those woods 20 years ago. The town had moved on. That's what people did with tragedies that stretched too long, that refused to resolve into neat narratives with clear endings. The memorial plaque at Jefferson Community Center had weathered and faded, the brass dulling to a greenish patina that made the engraved names hard to read in certain light. The annual vigil that once drew hundreds now attracted maybe a dozen people, mostly parents who'd known the boys, clutching electric candles that flickered weakly in the coastal wind. Aliza Hassan had stopped attending after year 7, not because she'd given up, but because the vigils felt like funerals, and she refused to mourn a son she knew was still out there somewhere, or had been, fighting to survive. Her neighbors whispered about her in the grocery store aisles. The woman who couldn't let go. The mother who'd lost her mind along with her child. Even her own sister, Nadia, had stopped calling after their last argument, when Aliza had refused to remove Jamal's bedroom furniture, refused to donate his clothes, refused to acknowledge what everyone else called inevitable. The apartment overlooked the harbor from a second-floor walk-up that smelled perpetually of salt and old wood. She'd lived there for 20 years, never missing a single month's rent, working administrative jobs that required no emotional investment, and left her free to dedicate her real energy to the search. The walls were covered in maps, printouts, photographs arranged in clusters connected by red string like something from a crime drama. Except this wasn't fiction. This was her life, distilled into pushpins and highlighted coordinates and folders organized by year. When Detective Silas called her back to the precinct 3 days after his visit, she knew what was coming. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a charcoal blazer over her usual comfortable clothes, pulling her gray-streaked hair into a neat bun. If they were going to try to bury her son a second time, she'd look them in the eye while she refused. The precinct conference room was generic and cold, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the table scarred with coffee rings and pen marks. Silas sat across from her with 2 other officials, a woman from the medical examiner's office and a man Aliza recognized as the county prosecutor. They had folders. They had sympathetic expressions. They had a death certificate with Jamal's name typed neatly across the top. The prosecutor spoke first, his voice measured and practiced. "Miss Hassan, we understand how difficult this has been. 20 years without answers is unimaginable. But with the recovery of the vehicle and the remains of 3 of the victims, we now have enough evidence to conclude what most likely happened that night." Aliza said nothing. She'd learned years ago that silence was more powerful than argument. The medical examiner took over, sliding photographs across the table that Aliza refused to look at. The crash was severe. High-speed impact, massive trauma. The 3 victims found in the vehicle died either immediately or within hours. Given the timeline, the weather conditions, that October there were storms the following week and the complete absence of any evidence suggesting your son or Connor Vance left the immediate area, the most logical conclusion is that they succumbed to exposure. And their remains were scattered by wildlife or natural decomposition over the years. You want me to sign that? Aliza gestured to the death certificate without touching it. You want me to legally declare my son dead so you can close your files and move on? Silas shifted in his seat. He hadn't spoken yet, and there was something in his expression that didn't match the rehearsed presentation. "Miss Hassan, I know this isn't what you want to hear. You're right. It's not." She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Because you haven't explained the adoption document. You haven't explained why Arthur Vance would be carrying paperwork that listed my son under a different last name. You haven't explained the arrangement of those bodies. The supplies Lila Kemp mentioned finding in the cargo area. The fact that the crash site doesn't match a panicked accident." The prosecutor frowned. "Those details are being reviewed, but they don't change the fundamental reality. Without any evidence that your son survived, I have evidence." Aliza cut him off. "I have 20 years of evidence. I have my son's presence. I have instinct you can't measure in your labs or photograph at your crime scenes. And I'm not signing anything that declares him dead when I know he fought to live." The room fell silent. The medical examiner exchanged a glance with the prosecutor. But Silas was watching Eliza with something that looked almost like respect. "The document bothers me too," he said quietly. The others turned to look at him. "The forged adoption petition. I've been going through Arthur Vance's background. He was involved with a local charity called Coastal Family Services. Low-profile operation, dealt with youth programs and family counseling. But the paperwork was sloppy. Corners were cut, and there are gaps in their records from 2004 and 2005 that I can't explain." Eliza felt something click into place. He was planning something. "The camping trip was a cover." "I don't know that yet," Silas said carefully. "But I'm not ready to close this case. Not until I understand what that document means and why 3 teenagers are still missing." The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Detective Silas, we've allocated significant resources to this investigation. The evidence supports natural causes. Then give me 2 weeks." Silas stood as well, his jaw set. 2 weeks to follow up on the charity connection and run down any remaining leads. "If I find nothing, Miss Hassan can make her decision then. But right now, I agree with her. Something doesn't add up." Eliza walked out of the precinct without signing the death certificate. The autumn sun was weak and watery, barely cutting through the coastal fog. She stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the salt air, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing against her chest. Detective Silas caught up with her in the parking lot. "I meant what I said in there. I'm going to keep digging." "Why?" Eliza asked, genuine curiosity breaking through her exhaustion. "Everyone else stopped caring years ago." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Because I read your son's school records. I saw his artwork. He had talent, Miss Hassan. Real talent. And I keep thinking about that sealed letter you mentioned, the one he was carrying that day. People don't clutch letters like lifelines unless they matter. I want to know what he was trying to say." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in months. She blinked them back. "Find him, detective. Find what happened to my boy." "I'll try." Silas handed her his card, though she already had 3 copies. "Call me if you remember anything else. Anything at all." She watched him walk back inside, then turned toward her car. She had work to do. The forged document was a thread, and she'd spent 20 years learning how to pull threads until entire tapestries unraveled. She wouldn't stop now. Not when she was finally being proven right. The memory arrived unbidden, triggered by the smell of diesel exhaust as Eliza sat in traffic that evening. Suddenly, she was back in the community center parking lot. October 2005, the afternoon sun slanting golden through the pines. She could hear Jamal's laugh, high and clear, as he joked with Marcus Reed about something stupid one of their teachers had said. Could see the way he kept touching his jacket pocket, patting it like he was making sure something precious hadn't disappeared. That sealed letter. She'd asked him about it that morning while he packed his backpack at the kitchen table. "Just something for the trip, Mom," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. Jamal was a terrible liar. His ears always went red when he tried to hide things. But she'd let it go, chalked it up to teenage secrets, maybe a note to a girl he liked or some personal writing he was embarrassed about. He was 15. He was entitled to privacy. God, she wished she'd pushed harder. Arthur Vance's SUV had pulled up exactly on time. 5 o'clock. Engine idling with that particular rattle older Fords made. Eliza had watched from across the lot as Vance climbed out, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, checking his watch. He looked nervous. No, not nervous, tense. Like a man walking towards something he'd been planning for too long. Something that couldn't be stopped now, even if he wanted to. Connor Vance had already claimed the front passenger seat, bouncing with typical teenage excitement. Marcus and Tyler were tossing their bags into the back, arguing about who had to sit in the middle. And Jamal had turned back one last time before climbing in, his dark eyes finding hers across the parking lot. That wave, that small, crooked finger wave that had been their private signal since he was small enough to fit in her arms. She'd waved back, smiling, thinking about the weekend ahead. 3 days of peace and quiet. Time to finish the novel sitting on her nightstand. Maybe deep clean the bathroom. The ordinary thoughts of a mother whose biggest concern was whether her son had packed enough clean socks. She'd watched the SUV pull away, watched it turn onto the main road, watched until the taillights disappeared behind the trees, and then she'd gone home, made herself dinner, settled in for a quiet Friday night. By Sunday evening, when the phone stayed silent and her calls went unanswered, the dread had already settled into her bones like winter cold. By Monday, when the police were called and search parties assembled, she'd already known something terrible had happened. But even then, even in those first awful days, she'd felt Jamal out there, alive, fighting. Everyone thought she was crazy. The grief counselor the department assigned had talked gently about denial, about the stages of loss, about finding healthy ways to process trauma. But Eliza didn't need a counselor. She needed someone to believe her. The memory released her as suddenly as it had arrived. She was back in her car, traffic moving again, the present day pressing in from all sides. But the flashback had crystallized something. Arthur Vance had been planning this. The nervous energy, the careful timing, the way he'd checked everything twice before driving away. This wasn't a spontaneous camping trip. This was orchestrated. Back at her apartment, Eliza pulled out every file she had on Arthur Vance. Tax records she'd obtained through creative public records requests. Employment history pieced together from old newspaper clippings and LinkedIn profiles. And there it was, highlighted in yellow from years ago Coastal Family Services. He'd been on the board of directors from 2003 to 2006, listed as Director of Youth Outreach. She cross-referenced the charity's listed address with her maps. It had operated out of a small office building near the harbor, long since converted to condos. But the nonprofit had owned other properties too, according to the tax records. A small retreat center used for family counseling sessions. And there, buried in a footnote she'd skimmed over a decade ago, a notation about auxiliary facilities in the Northern Preserve region. Eliza grabbed her keys. The Northern Preserve, where Lila Kemp had found the SUV. It couldn't be coincidence. The drive took 90 minutes, winding through increasingly rural roads until she reached the forest access point closest to the recovery site. The police had cleared out days ago, leaving only orange tape fluttering from trees and deep tire ruts in the mud. She parked and started walking, following the trail markers Lila had described in the news interview. The ravine was easy to find. There were still evidence flags planted in the ground, yellow plastic snapping in the breeze. But Eliza kept going, circling wider, looking for anything the investigators might have missed. She'd learned over 20 years that police looked for evidence of crimes. She was looking for evidence of her son. A quarter-mile from the crash site, she found it. A flattened area barely visible beneath 2 decades of growth, but distinct if you knew what to look for. The trees were younger here, thinner, suggesting the area had been cleared once. And there, half buried under leaves and dirt, the rusted corner of what looked like a fire ring. Someone had camped here, recently enough that the metal hadn't completely deteriorated. Eliza knelt, pulling away debris with her bare hands. More metal, a tent stake, pieces of what might have been a tarp, the synthetic material breaking apart in her fingers but still recognizable. This was a campsite. Organized, intentional. Not something you'd find if teenagers had simply wandered away from a crash and died of exposure. Someone had lived here. For days, maybe weeks, and the police had walked right past it. She pulled out her phone and called Silas. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Hassan, I'm at the preserve, near where the SUV was found." "Detective, they didn't just crash and die. Someone survived. Someone made camp. And I think I know why Arthur Vance brought them out here." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Don't touch anything else. I'm on my way. Eliza stood, looking around the abandoned campsite with new eyes. Jamal had been here. She could feel it, that same certainty that had sustained her through 20 years of skepticism and dismissal. He'd survived the crash. He'd fought. And somewhere in these woods, hidden beneath layers of time and earth and decay, was the proof that would finally vindicate everything she'd believed. She just had to find it before anyone else did. Detective Silas arrived with a forensics team 40 minutes later, but by then Eliza had already borrowed a metal detector from a local equipment rental place. She'd learned long ago that waiting for official channels meant watching evidence disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The technicians spread out across the campsite, photographing and bagging, while Silas stood with his arms crossed, watching Eliza sweep the detector in careful grids. "You do this often?" he asked, not quite joking. "More than you'd think." The detector beeped weakly near the base of a half-rotted stump. She knelt, brushing away layers of pine needles and decomposed leaves. Her fingers hit something solid wood, maybe metal. She dug faster, ignoring the dirt wedging under her fingernails. It was a door. A root cellar door, the wood warped and swollen but still intact, covered with 2 decades of forest debris. Silas called over 2 techs, and they pried it open together, the hinges screaming with rust. The smell that wafted up was earth and decay and something else, something that made Eliza's heart hammer against her ribs. The space below was small, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, the walls lined with crumbling concrete. Water had seeped in over the years, leaving everything coated in a layer of black mold. But there, wedged into a corner behind a collapsed wooden shelf, was a shoebox wrapped in layers of plastic garbage bags. Eliza climbed down before anyone could stop her. The plastic crinkled as she pulled it free, surprisingly intact despite the moisture. Through the clouded layers she could see something inside, pale and rectangular. Paper. "Miss Hessen, you need to let forensics handle that," Silas called down, but his voice was distant, unimportant. She tore through the plastic with shaking hands. The shoebox was water-damaged but recognizable, a Nike box, the kind Gemel had kept his art supplies in. Inside, nestled in what remained of tissue paper, was an envelope. The same white envelope she'd seen him clutch 20 years ago in the community center parking lot. Her name was written across the front in Jamal's angular handwriting, the ink faded to brown but still legible. She opened it. The letter inside was written on notebook paper, the edges ragged where it had been torn from a spiral binding. The date at the top made her breath catch. April 2007, 18 months after he'd disappeared. "Mom," it began, and her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for 2 decades. "If you're reading this, it means someone finally found it. It means you never stopped looking. I knew you wouldn't." The letter detailed everything. How Arthur Vance had driven them not to a campground but to this isolated preserve, claiming car trouble and suggesting they camp while he hiked out for help. How he'd returned with zip ties and duct tape instead of assistance. How he'd kept them in the root cellar, bringing supplies every few days. Talking about family and belonging and things that made no sense. How Marcus and Tyler had died in the initial crash when Vance deliberately ran the SUV off the road to make it look like an accident, but Jamal and Connor had survived. How they'd escaped once, making it 3 miles before Vance tracked them down. "He kept saying I was his blood," Jamal had written. "That I belonged with him. That my real family had kept secrets I deserved to know. I don't understand what he meant, Mom, but I know he's insane. And I know Connor and I are running out of time. We're planning another escape. Connor thinks there's an old water tower near the coast, maybe 2 days' walk. If we can reach it, we can find help." The letter ended with words that shattered something in Eliza's chest. "I fought for you, Mom. My promise is still out there." She climbed out of the root cellar, clutching the letter like a lifeline. Silas took one look at her face and immediately cleared the area, setting up a perimeter. They drove back to the precinct in silence. Eliza holding the evidence bag containing her son's last words. In Silas's office, under harsh fluorescent lights, she watched as forensics photographed every inch of the letter. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was Jamal's. The paper dated to approximately 2006 to 2007 based on manufacturing watermarks. The ink matched pens available during that time period. Every technical detail confirmed what Eliza had known the moment she'd seen her name written in her son's hand. Jamal had survived. For 18 months, he'd fought and hoped and planned, believing his mother would never stop searching. And she hadn't. Even when the entire world told her to give up, she'd kept looking. Silas sat across from her, the letter spread between them like evidence of something holy. This changes everything. We're reopening this as an abduction and possible homicide. I'm calling in state resources. Getting cadaver dogs. The full investigation. The water tower, Eliza said, her voice hoarse. He mentioned an old water tower near the coast. Where would that be? Silas was already pulling up property records on his computer. There are 3 abandoned industrial sites within a 50-mile radius. One of them used to have a water tower before it was decommissioned in the 90s. He clicked through files, his jaw tightening. It's an old dockyard, owned by a holding company that traces back to... He stopped, looking up at her. Coastal Family Services. The charity Arthur Vance worked for. Eliza stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve absolute. Then that's where we'll find my son. The precinct records archive smelled like old paper and fluorescent dust. Silas had been down here for 6 hours, pulling every file related to Arthur Vance, Coastal Family Services, and the original missing persons case. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made his stomach turn. Arthur Vance had a brother, Daniel Vance, dead 10 years before the teenagers vanished. At age 35. Death certificate listed cause as suicide. But Daniel's background was what caught Silas's attention. He'd been an artist. Struggling and troubled, bouncing between teaching gigs and gallery shows that never quite took off. There were police reports for domestic disturbances, a restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend, a pattern of instability that had ended with pills, and a closed-door bedroom. Buried in Daniel's estate papers was something Silas almost missed. A receipt from a private DNA testing lab, dated 1989, 16 years before the disappearance. The sample labels were coded, anonymous, but the billing address was Arthur Vance's home. Silas called the lab. After 2 hours of legal wrangling and warrant threats, they confirmed what the receipt suggested. The test had been ordered to establish paternity. One sample belonged to Daniel Vance. The other belonged to an infant male. Identity sealed. He cross-referenced the date with Jamal Hassan's birth certificate. The timeline matched perfectly. Back at his desk, Silas spread out everything he had. Eliza's statements about her marriage. She'd been separated from Jamal's legal father for most of her pregnancy. A brief reconciliation that had lasted just long enough for the birth certificate to be filed before the relationship ended permanently. She'd never spoken much about that time, and Silas hadn't pushed. Now he understood why. Daniel Vance had been Jamal's biological father. A brief affair, maybe a relationship Eliza had tried to leave behind. And Arthur Vance had known. He'd had his brother tested, had proof his nephew existed, and when Daniel died, Arthur had become obsessed with claiming the only living connection to his estranged brother. The forged adoption document, the camping trip, the root cellar prison. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Arthur Vance hadn't been trafficking kids or running some predatory scheme. He'd been trying to kidnap his own nephew, to force a family connection that existed only in his disturbed mind. Silas picked up his phone and called Eliza. When she answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to come down to the station. There's something about Jamal's biological father you need to know." The conversation in his office was brutal. Eliza sat rigid as Silas explained what he'd found, her face draining of color when he showed her the DNA test receipt. "Daniel Vance," she whispered. "I didn't know he had a brother. It was 20 years ago, just a few months, nothing serious. When I found out I was pregnant, Daniel was already spiraling. I couldn't bring a child into that chaos." "Arthur knew," Silas said gently. And when Daniel died, Arthur fixated on Jamal. The charity gave him access to youth programs, ways to observe from a distance. And when he finally made his move, he used the camping trip as cover. Eliza's hands were shaking. He stole my son because of blood, because he thought he had some claim. Obsession doesn't follow logic, Miss Hassan. But it does follow patterns. Silas pulled up the property records again. The letter mentioned a water tower. I found it the old Bayside dockyard, shut down in 1998. Arthur Vance's family owned the company before it went bankrupt. If he needed a place to hide, somewhere isolated and familiar, that's where he'd go. They assembled the team within hours. State police, forensic anthropologists, cadaver dogs, the full apparatus of an active homicide investigation. The drive to the dockyard took 2 hours. The industrial site sprawling and rusted, surrounded by chain-link fence half collapsed with age. The water tower rose above it all, a skeletal structure against the gray coastal sky. The dogs hit on a warehouse near the eastern edge of the property. Inside, past the collapsed loading docks and stacks of rotting pallets, they found a concrete vault built into the floor, the kind of thing used for storing chemicals or valuables, sealed with a heavy metal door. When they opened it, the smell confirmed what everyone already knew. 2 skeletons lay inside, curled together as if seeking warmth, or comfort, or some final human connection before the end. The forensic team worked quickly, documenting everything, bagging evidence with practiced efficiency. Dental records confirmed their identities within days. Jamal Hassan, age 15 at time of death. Connor Vance, age 16. Estimated time of death, spring 2007, approximately 18 months after their disappearance. Cause of death: dehydration and starvation, compounded by untreated injuries and exposure. They'd made it to the water tower. They'd found the place Jamal had written about in his letter, but they'd never made it out. The memorial service was held on a cliff overlooking the ocean, in a small cemetery where the old pines bent permanently eastward from decades of wind. The community turned out in numbers that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, guilt and grief mingling with a collective need to finally bear witness. The mayor spoke. The school principal spoke. Parents who'd lost their own children 20 years ago stood together, hands clasped, finding something like peace in the truth. Eliza stood at the graveside in a black dress she'd owned for years but never worn, waiting for this exact moment. She didn't cry. The tears had come later, in private, in the days after Silas had called with the forensic confirmation. Now she felt only a strange, hollow vindication. She'd been right. For 20 years, against every voice that told her to accept and move on and let go. She'd been right. Jamal had fought. He'd survived 18 months in hell, had escaped and been recaptured and kept going because he believed his mother would never stop looking. And she hadn't, even when it cost her relationships and reputation and any semblance of a normal life. She'd kept searching. The promise between mother and son had been kept on both sides, right up until the very end. Detective Silas stood slightly apart from the crowd, his hands folded in front of him. After the service, as people drifted away in small clusters, he approached Eliza at the grave. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner," he said quietly. "I read through the old case files last night. 3 different detectives told you the same thing. That you needed to accept reality. That hope without evidence was just denial. They were wrong," Eliza said simply. She placed a hand on the fresh-turned earth, feeling the solid weight of it. "Hope isn't about evidence, detective. It's about refusing to let someone be forgotten. It's about being the keeper of a memory when everyone else moves on." "Your son was brave," Silas said. "The letter, the escape attempts, the way he protected Connor even at the end. That takes extraordinary courage. He got that from his mother." The voice came from behind them. Nadia, Eliza's sister, whom she hadn't spoken to in 8 years. The 2 women looked at each other across the space of a decade's worth of arguments and hurt, and then Nadia stepped forward and pulled her into a fierce hug. "I'm sorry. I should have believed you." I should have been there. Eliza let herself be held, let herself lean into someone else's strength for just a moment. You're here now. That's enough. The crowd dispersed slowly, and eventually Eliza stood alone at the grave as the afternoon light turned golden. She'd sold the wall of maps and evidence, had taken down the red strings and pushpins, had finally cleared out the shrine that her apartment had become. But she'd kept one thing, a framed photograph of Jamal at 15, grinning at the camera with charcoal smudged on his cheek from an afternoon of drawing. Back at her apartment that evening, she stood at the window overlooking the harbor. The ocean was calm, reflecting the last light of day in sheets of silver and rose. The case was closed. The truth was known. Arthur Vance had died in that initial crash, had never faced justice for what he'd done, but at least the story was complete. Grief would come and go in waves. Eliza knew. Some days would be harder than others. But underneath it all was something she hadn't felt in 20 years: peace. Not joy, not happiness, but the quiet satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. She picked up the photograph, tracing the line of her son's jaw with one finger. His eyes stared back at her, dark and defiant and full of life, exactly as she remembered from that last wave in the parking lot. Your promise is home, my fighter. She whispered to the image, to the memory, to the boy who'd never stopped believing his mother would find him. We won. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the power of a mother's love or the importance of never giving up on the truth, then I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to Cold Trail, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Tell someone else about this case. These stories matter because they remind us that behind every cold case file is a real person who deserved better, who fought harder than we'll ever know, and who needs someone to remember them. Eliza Hassan spent 20 years refusing to let her son become a statistic. The least we can do is spend a few seconds making sure Jamal's story is heard. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join me next time as we dive into another case that deserves to be brought out of the cold. Thank you for listening. This is Cold Trail.